The desert wind dragged itself across the empty land like an old man, coughing, stirring dust that clung to every stone and fence post. Near the edge of that land where grass thinned and the earth turned raw and cracked, a girl stumbled barefoot, her wrists still lined with rope burns. Ellie did not think of where her steps carried her. She only thought of moving north like the trembling voice of the boy had told her, the one who cut her bonds and left her in the weeds with nothing but shame and a chance. Her body ached as if every bone was cracked glass. Her lips bled when she tried to swallow. Each time the wind shifted, the smell of water teased her nose. Dry stream beds that promised relief yet gave nothing. She carried no memory of how long she had walked. Minutes bled into hours into something shapeless. All she knew was that behind her lay a grave, meant for her body, and before her stretched the unknown. The sun leaned west hard and low, a white eye pressed against her skin. Heat shimmered in ripples that bent the horizon into a cruel mirage. Ellie pressed her hands to her belly, felt the bruises bloom deeper, and kept moving. She had not spoken since that single whisper, please, the one she gave when no one listened. Now the word haunted her throat like a thorn. When the sky bled orange, she collapsed near a crooked mesquite. Dust clung to her lashes. Her breaths came shallow. She thought of the house she once cleaned, the scent of soap, the stiff linens, the silence between footsteps. She thought of the sheriff's son, Clayton, and how his voice had carried no weight when he ordered her in. It was as if he were ordering lunch. No rage, no need. Only a statement, take her out back, tie her, drown her, if the water swallows her whole. Ellie tried to banish the sound, but it lived behind her eyelids, a brand burned into thought. She must have drifted because when she opened her eyes again, the stars had scattered across the black. Coyotes yipped somewhere distant. The air cooled enough that she could taste the metal of her breath. She dragged herself upright, staggering like a child learning to walk, and followed the faint slope of land toward where the moonlight brushed something wooden fence posts, broken and leaning. Beyond them stood a cabin, old, forgotten, its roof sagging where storms had pressed it down its chimney, black with years of smoke. She blinked hard, half afraid it was only another mirage. But the smell of wood, the faint curl of smoke rising, told her it was real. She touched the splintered post for balance, her nails torn and dirt-caked, and stepped forward. Inside that cabin, Jonas had just finished pouring coffee into a dented tin cup. The man was broad but bent his shoulders, carrying the memory of too many graves. He had buried his wife beneath a cottonwood tree 2 winters past, and since then, the cabin had held only dust, wood smoke, and silence. Yet habit kept him alive. Habit and the slow discipline of tending to what little land still yielded. When he stepped out with his cup, he saw her. At first he thought it was a ghost, some wandering spirit pushed from the graveyard by restless winds. A girl, torn clothes, clinging blood streaking her legs, her eyes hollow yet burning with something raw. She froze when she saw him, as if caught between begging and fleeing, but her body had no strength left for either. Jonas did not shout. He did not raise his rifle. He simply stood, the cup cooling in his hand. His voice, when it came, was slow and low-shaped by years of silence. "You lost, girl." Her throat worked sound scraping its way out. Not a cry, not a scream. Only a whisper, the same words she had once said to a man who never heard her. "Please, don't judge me." The words carried more than a plea. They carried the weight of shame, of wounds deeper than skin of a heart, broken not by accident, but by cruelty. Jonas felt something stir inside his chest, something he had thought gone with his wife. Not pity, not fear, something heavier. He stepped closer, careful, as though approaching a skittish horse. He saw the rope marks, the bruises, the trembling that never stilled. She swayed about to fold into the dirt, and without thinking he reached out. Her body was light, too light, as he lifted her. Her head lolled against his chest. Jonas carried her past the broken fence, through the old door, into the cabin that had forgotten the sound of another's breath. He laid her on the bed against the wall, the one he had not touched since fever took the woman who once slept there. The blanket smelled of cedar, faint and faded. Ellie did not fight, did not speak. She simply stared upward, as though the ceiling still tied her down. He set water by her side, bread he had baked 2 days before, and a strip of cloth clean enough to wipe blood. Then he stepped out to the porch and sat, rifle across his knees, staring at the dark hills. For the first time in 10 years, his chest felt heavy, not with grief alone, but with the weight of someone else's survival. Through the night, he heard her stir, once a faint sob, another time the crunch of bread between weak teeth. By morning, the water was half gone. When Jonas entered, he noticed the mirror above the washstand had been covered with a towel. Ellie did not want to see what the world had done to her. For days, she spoke nothing. She watched him when he came in, her eyes following, but her mouth still. Sometimes he caught her holding a scrap of fabric needle poised, though no stitches formed, as though the memory of sewing was the only thing left that was truly hers. One evening, when the light through the window was red and long, she finally spoke. Her voice rasped like dry reeds. "If I can still sew," she asked, "does that mean I'm still a person?" Jonas stared at the floor, words choking. He had no answer. The silence between them felt like another wound, one that would take more than food or water to heal. And yet in that silence, something began to grow small, fragile but real. Morning settled on the cabin like a hand pressed gently against a feverish brow. Jonas moved with the quiet rhythm of someone who had spent years negotiating with silence. He stoked the coals, coaxed a blue thread of flame from the gray set pot to simmer with beans, onion, and a rind of salt pork he had been saving for a leaner day than most. He supposed this counted. Outside, the cottonwood leaves chattered even when the air was still, as if the tree itself remembered news the world preferred to forget. Ellie sat on the edge of the bed, bare feet curled against the floorboards as if the wood might split and swallow her. She held the needle again, this time with thread, the point glinting whenever the sun found it through the window. She lifted the corner of a torn shirt, the fabric frayed, stains dulled to a brown, the color of remembered hurt, and pressed the edges together. The first stitch shook. The second held. The third went in straighter. By the time Jonas set the tin bowl on the table, the seam had begun to look like something meant to last. "Eat what you can," he said. The words felt clumsy in his mouth. He had not said more than practical sentences to any soul in months. "Bring in the kindling. Mend the fence. Watch the weather." He did not know how to talk to a person who had been undressed of her own name by another's hands. He did not know if saying her name would help or harm, so he waited for her to claim it first. Still saying nothing felt like surrender. "Ellie," she said, as if she had heard him thinking. She did not look up. She slid the needle through again, drew the thread tight, then set the shirt down before it could shake out of her grip. "My name is Ellie." Jonas nodded, though she wasn't watching. Jonas. The bean stung her tongue with salt and smoke. She swallowed carefully. Midway through the bowl, she paused and glanced at the towel-draped mirror. Her mouth tightened. "I used to fold linens," she said, not to him, perhaps to the air just above the table. "If you fold them right, the corners meet like a prayer. My mother taught me that. She said people can tell what you believe by how you treat simple things." Jonas set his hands flat on the table to keep them from fidgeting. "That true?" he said. "I don't know," she answered, as if reconsidering the world's arithmetic. "I believed in the law, too." The word hung there. Law. A brittle word in a land that liked to chew rules into something easier to swallow. Jonas had once measured his days by the small obediences that keep a man from turning wild tools set in the same place. Animals fed before noon, debts paid, and full words kept. The law had buried his wife under a mistake. No one owned a fever, misnamed and untreated, until it became a funeral. He had not spoken that quarrel aloud to anyone. He would not begin now. But the way the words scraped his chest told Ellie enough. She reached for the towel and stopped. "Is it still me there?" she whispered. Jonas did not look. "It'll be you." She didn't lift the cloth. Instead, she pulled the shirt to her lap again and set the needle walking. As she sewed, her voice unspooled in short strands, no tidy narrative, just pieces like scraps saved in a basket for some future quilt. Clayton's laugh, the smell of whiskey and saddle soap, the sound a rope makes when it tightens against its own knot, a boy's hands shaking and a knife sawing through strands in the dark. "Walk north," the boy had said. "Don't stop." She had wanted to tell him she didn't know where north was. The moon had shown her anyway. Jonas listened without interruption. Once he rose and stepped to the doorway, as if the air indoors had grown too tight for breathing. Outside, the country was brown and gold and tired. Far off, the ridge folded the horizon into a broken smile. He knew that somewhere beyond those teeth lay town, its saloon with the moth-eaten piano, its clapboard church that smelled more of dust than salvation, its jail with a cot softer than the ground and harder than truth. The sheriff there wore duty like a coat that never quite fit. The sheriff's son wore it like a trophy won at a crooked game. By late afternoon, Ellie's head drooped with sleep she could not long hold. Jonas set a bucket by the door, a bar of lye soap on the washstand, and a blue cotton dress folded at the foot of the bed. It had belonged to his wife once, simple, durable, with a hem let down twice. He hesitated, then left it. He wrote the moment off as practicality. He knew better. When the sun began to lower and shadows found their corners, hooves sounded faint on the far side of the ridge. Jonas stiffened, one hand sliding toward the rifle propped against the wall. He had learned the weight of every neighbor's nag and mule over the years. This sounded different, hurried like a thought trying to outrun itself. The rider crested the rise and pulled up at the edge of the yard where the fence had fallen into a forgetful zigzag. He was young, face marked with fresh bruises that purpled under dust, lips split like a peeled grape. His hat sat wrong because his head hurt. His hands trembled just enough to make the reins jump. He saw Jonas and swallowed like a man about to drink something that might choke him. "You know me," he said, voice frayed. "Or you know of me." "I know you're kind," Jonas answered slow. The boy nodded, almost grateful for the insult he felt he deserved. "Tommy." He offered the name as if it might be a kind of surrender. "I was told to finish what I didn't do." His gaze skipped to the open door, the dim inside where a shape could be a girl or a ghost. "I can't." Ellie stood then, drawn by the voice she recognized from weeds and darkness. Her bare feet halted just shy of the threshold. She didn't step onto the porch. She didn't step back either. In the slanting light, the rope marks on her wrists showed like red bracelets. Tommy saw them and flinched as if they were his. "I ain't here to harm," he said, the words spilling as if they would rot if kept. "Clayton knows. I mean, he suspects. Folks been whispering a girl was seen. He put me on it. Then he beat me for not doing it the first time. He'll come himself if I don't fix it. And he won't bring questions, just men who don't mind answers already chosen." Jonas's jaw tightened. "Why tell us?" Tommy's eyes slicked the way dirt does when rain finally finds it. "Because I thought if I said it out loud, it might make me pick a thing worth standing on." I thought he glanced at Ellie and the sentence snapped. "I ain't asking forgiveness. I'm asking to stand where my feet don't slide." Ellie studied him with a steadiness that made him shift. "You had a choice," she said, voice low. "You made it once." The not killing hung there between them, the mercy he had already shown. "What do you want now?" "To be the sort of man who don't need telling which way north is," Tommy said, "and to keep Clayton from finishing what he started." Jonas weighed the boys, shaking, the bruise blooming along the cheekbone, the way the hand that hovered near the holster never quite settled there. A coward could learn courage if given something larger to be afraid of than himself. A mix of anger and old grief stirred in Jonas like coals given air. He had not picked a side in years. The land doesn't ask for it. People do. "It won't be enough to hide," Jonas said. "You know that." Tommy nodded. "Then we don't. We take it into the street while folks can't look away." The idea cracked open the room like lightning. Outside, the light thinned. Birds stitched themselves into the cottonwood and fell silent. A far dog barked twice. Jonas turned his gaze to Ellie. She hugged her arms across her ribs, making herself smaller, as if the air might confuse her with a shadow and let her pass. Then she straightened, a small movement so deliberate it felt like a vow. "If it stays quiet," she said, "he wins twice." Jonas's eyes met hers. He nodded once, slow. "Morning then," he said, "in daylight." The plan did not unwind in words after that, not really. It assembled itself from what each already carried. Jonas oiled the rifle and checked the sights by lamplight. Tommy sat with his back against the porch post, gun laid across his thighs like a sleeping animal he didn't quite trust. Ellie took the blue dress to the washstand. She did not lift the towel from the mirror. She had no wish to count her bruises. She washed slow because the body needs time to relearn where it ends and the world begins. When she slipped the dress over her head, the cotton lay against her skin with the quiet weight of something honest. Later, she stepped onto the porch. The moon had climbed to a place that made the yard silver. Tommy, eyes closed, whispered a tangle of misery and wish that men sometimes mistake for prayer. Jonas listened to the night measure itself in small sounds, boards settling, branch rasping, breath moving. He thought of his wife's hands, how they used to smooth his shirt as if pressing blessings into fabric. He thought of the town, its people tilting toward what was easy. He thought of Clayton, the clean, empty space where conscience should live. When they come, Tommy said, eyes still shut, it'll get loud. Maybe, Jonas answered. Maybe it'll get quiet first. Ellie stood between them, the hem of the blue dress brushing her ankles. She did not say, please. She did not say, don't judge me. She said nothing at all, and the nothing felt like a door opening. Morning would choose its own pace. Men would wake and drink and decide whether to keep looking away. Hooves would bite dust. Someone would laugh too loud outside the saloon, not knowing the laugh would curdle in his throat. The three of them would ride not by moon, not by secrecy, but in the plain sun where truth either stands or burns. And somewhere beyond the ridge, Clayton brushed dirt from his sleeve and smiled at a joke that wasn't funny already, smelling the kind of victory that comes from fear. He did not yet know that fear had finally chosen a different home. The dawn came dry and sharp, the kind of morning that left no room for hesitation. Jonas saddled his mule with the same slow care he had always used, though his hands shook a little when he cinched the girth. Ellie stood on the porch, her face pale but her chin lifted the blue dress, catching the pale light like a faded flame. Tommy lingered at the edge of the yard, tugging nervously at the reins of a skittish bay. His bruises looked darker in daylight, the split lip raw, his eyes swollen but stubborn. You sure of this? Jonas asked, voice low. He didn't look at either of them while tightening the saddle strap. Sure of nothing, Tommy answered. But I'd rather bleed in the street than rot in shame. Ellie didn't speak. She only stepped down from the porch, barefoot, still refusing the old boots Jonas had offered. The dirt stung, but she didn't flinch. She wanted the ground to feel her, wanted the earth itself to remember she had stood upon it. When Jonas glanced at her, she met his gaze steady. It was answer enough. They rode slow toward town, not as fugitives, not as shadows. The sun climbed higher, peeling the night from the land, exposing every scar the desert carried. Along the way, Jonas kept his rifle strapped across his back. Ellie sat upright on the mule behind him, and Tommy rode with his head bent as if every hoofbeat echoed his doubt. When they reached the outskirts, children playing marbles in the dust stopped and stared. Women paused at wash lines, their hands frozen around damp cloth. Men leaned from porches, cigarettes dangling expressions, shifting from curiosity to recognition. Word traveled faster than wind here, and whispers had already planted their roots. Clayton was at the saloon, laughter spilling from his mouth like liquor. His friends gathered around loud in the comfort of his shadow, but the laughter thinned when hoofbeats cracked the morning stillness. Jonas reined in, first dismounted slow, letting the silence stretch. Tommy followed, dragging Jack Clayton's other boy tied and bruised behind his horse. Ellie climbed down last, her legs trembling but her spine unbent. The crowd parted. Faces turned, mouths opened and closed without sound. When Jonas pointed straight at Clayton, the noise drained from the street. This girl was left for dead by him. Jonas said, his voice steady, heavy enough to fall on every ear. Gasps rippled. Women pulled children close. Men shifted uneasy. Ellie stepped forward, lifted her arm, and peeled away the cloth covering the deep rope burns. The marks glowed angry red against her skin. She worked in the sheriff's house, Jonas continued. She said no once. This is what it cost her. Clayton barked a laugh, loud and sharp, but it landed wrong, echoing hollow. You'll believe a whore over me? He sneered. Before the crowd could sway, Tommy stepped forward. His voice cracked but carried. He threw a torn dress onto the dirt, its bloodstains like rusted scars. I was there. I was told to kill her. I couldn't, because I knew the truth. Murmurs rose like a storm about to break. Men who had shared whiskey with Clayton now shifted their weight away from him. Women glared with eyes that had known too many quiet bruises. The sheriff shoved through face-flushed hand, trembling as he reached for the irons at his belt. Son, he growled, but the word cracked in his mouth, no longer shield but curse. Clayton's smirk faltered. His eyes darted, searching for the loyalty he had always assumed was his, but the crowd had already turned. When the sheriff snapped the cuffs around his wrists, Clayton kicked and cursed, spitting venom into the dust. No one stepped forward to help him. No one raised a gun. They didn't need to. His power had bled out in silence, drained by truth too loud to ignore. Ellie stood there shaking, but her eyes blazed. She was no longer the girl tied to a wagon. She was the woman who made an entire town look itself in the mirror. Yet as Clayton was dragged away, Jonas felt no victory, only the weight of what came next. For when a man like Clayton falls, the dust never settles. That night, the cabin breathed differently. Ellie no longer covered the mirror. She let it hang bare, though she still avoided her reflection. She planted herbs behind the house, her hands careful in the soil, as if coaxing life where death had nearly taken root. Tommy stayed close, splitting wood-mending fences, always quiet, always carrying guilt like a stone he refused to set down. Ellie watched him sometimes, her face unreadable, as if measuring the space between cowardice and redemption. Jonas sat on the porch pipe between his teeth, watching them both. For the first time in a decade, he felt something that resembled family. Not by blood, not by law, but by choice. But the West did not forgive easy. Clayton's arrest was not an ending. It was a spark in dry grass. Whispers turned to questions, questions to anger. And in the corners of the saloon, men who had once laughed with Clayton now muttered about revenge, about law twisted into shame. Jonas knew it was only a matter of time before dust rose again. This time not from hooves carrying truth, but from riders carrying fire. The question was no longer whether they had survived. It was whether they could endure what survival would demand next. The morning after Clayton was taken in irons, the town woke uneasy. Doors opened slower. Men carried rifles, even when fetching water, and the saloon poured whiskey before noon. Though no shots had been fired, something heavier than smoke lingered in the air, a silence that pressed against windows and refused to leave. Jonas, Ellie, and Tommy rode back to the cabin without speaking. Each carried a different weight. Jonas felt the stares that had followed them out of town, the way neighbors measured him now, as something more than a hermit with a broken fence. Ellie's hands trembled on the reins, not from fear, but from the exhaustion of having stood in the center of judgment and survived. Tommy sat crooked in his saddle bruises, stiff shame raw, yet there was a set to his jaw that had not been there before. When they reached the cabin, Jonas unsaddled, slow hands deliberate, as if still calming a horse after thunder. Ellie disappeared inside, returning moments later with a bucket which she set down by the herb patch she had begun. She knelt, pulling at weeds, her fingers black with soil. Every tug at the earth seemed to anchor her body, to remind her she was still here, not a whisper swallowed by water. Tommy lingered at the porch rail, tracing a splinter with his thumb. "They'll come," he muttered, not looking at either of them. Jonas struck a match, lit his pipe, and let the smoke curl. "Maybe, maybe not." "No," Tommy said louder. "I know men like Clayton. Jail don't hold them, not when his pa's the one with the key. Even if the sheriff put irons on his own boy, the town'll split over it. Some'll say it proves law's real. Some'll say it proves law's a joke." He swallowed hard. "Either way, they'll come looking at us." Ellie straightened dirt on her hands, hair loose around her shoulders. "Let them look," she said. Her voice was quiet but carried like a blade that doesn't need to be drawn to be feared. Jonas studied her, the steadiness in her face. She had been a shadow when she first stumbled into his yard. Now there was steel under the bruises, something the beating had failed to take. It stirred something dangerous and holy in him, the same thing that had led him to stand in the street the day before. That night a knock came at the door. Not the kind made by fists eager for trouble, but slow, uncertain raps that barely echoed. Jonas lifted his rifle before opening. Standing there was an older woman, apron, dusty hair tied back tight. Behind her, two younger girls clung close. "We seen what happened," the woman said, eyes darting past him toward Ellie. "Folks been saying she's ruined, that she should have just kept quiet. But my girls," she looked down, her jaw working. "My girls saw her stand tall yesterday. They ain't stopped talking about it. They wanted to bring this." She held out a bundle of fabric linen, neatly folded, corners square. Ellie's breath caught as she stepped forward. Her hands touched the cloth like it was a sacred book. "Corners meet like a prayer," Ellie whispered. The woman nodded once, then turned away without another word. Her daughters followed, skirts brushing dust. Jonas closed the door slow. Ellie pressed the cloth to her chest, her eyes glassy but unspilled. "Not everyone turns away," Jonas said. Tommy shifted, uncomfortable. "But enough will." And he was right. 2 nights later, riders appeared at the ridge, torches flickering. Jonas spotted them, first silhouettes against the moonlight. He motioned Ellie inside, but she stayed at the doorway, eyes locked on the flames. Voices carried on the wind, threats, laughter too loud, words meant to scare. "Send her out," someone shouted. "Send the whore out and we'll forget the rest." Jonas stepped forward, rifle steady. Tommy stood beside him, pistol in hand, though his fingers shook. Ellie remained behind them, not hidden, but watching. The riders circled, then pulled back when no shot came. One spat into the dirt. You think the sheriff will keep his boy locked up forever? You think truth matters out here? It don't. Only fear does. Jonas raised his rifle just enough that the moon caught the barrel. Then fear, this, he said, calm as stone. For a moment, no one moved. Then the riders cursed, turned their horses, and disappeared into the hills. But Jonas knew it was not victory, only delay. Inside the cabin felt smaller. The herbs behind the house smelled strong. The folded cloth sat on the table, and the silence pressed like an extra wall. Ellie sat with needle and thread again, her hands steadier now, sewing the edge of the linen. We can't run, she said. If we do, it follows. We stand, maybe it stops. Tommy looked at her as though seeing something more than a girl who had survived. He saw a standard, a banner he might choose to follow. Then we stand, he said, softer than a promise, but firmer than a wish. Jonas leaned back, pipe smoke curling. He remembered the question Ellie had asked days ago. If I can still sew, does that mean I'm still a person? He looked at her now, stitching life back into torn fabric, and thought the answer had already been given. But outside the West shifted restless. And he knew the hardest part was not the fight itself, but what came after when the dust cleared, and people had to decide if they could live with the truth they had just seen. The days that followed bled together like ink and rain. At the cabin, the rhythm of survival stitched itself into something that looked almost like life. Jonas cut woodchuck traps, patched the roof where wind had clawed shingles loose. Ellie tended the herb patch, boiled roots into bitter tea, and mended clothes with thread so thin it nearly vanished in her hands. Tommy lingered near the barn, working harder than the task required, as if sweat alone might rinse away guilt. But the air carried weight. The ridge seemed to hold its breath. Every hoofbeat in the distance tightened their shoulders. Even the mule grew skittish ears, flicking at shadows that weren't there. One evening, while the sun burned down red and low, Ellie spread the folded linen on the table. She smoothed the corners carefully, pressing the creases flat. Then she spoke without lifting her eyes. When Clayton looked at me, it wasn't anger. It wasn't even want. It was nothing. Like I was already gone. Her hands shook, but her voice stayed even. That's worse than hate. Worse than hurt. It's when you don't matter enough to even hate. Jonas's jaw worked. He set down his cup, the tin clattering louder than he meant. You matter here, he said, rough as gravel. Ellie looked up, startled by the sharpness, then softened. That's why it scares me. I don't know what to do with mattering. Tommy shifted in his chair. His lips still cracked, his eyes restless. Clayton matters to them, he said. More than he should. Some men see him as what they'd be if they had no chains. Others, they're just afraid. Fear makes cowards loyal. Jonas leaned back, smoke from his pipe curling. Fear cuts both ways. Yesterday they saw him fall. Men don't forget that. Still, he knew Clayton's fall wasn't finished. Men like him didn't break quiet. They shattered loud enough to wound everything nearby. 3 nights later, proof came. Hoofbeats again, but this time not circling and taunting. This time 4 riders. No torches. Guns glinted faint in starlight. They came close enough to the cabin that Jonas could smell horse sweat. Jonas already had his rifle propped by the door. Tommy crouched low, pistol steady, though his breath came ragged. Ellie held a lantern inside, shielding the flame with her palm, so it wouldn't betray them through the window. A voice called out, calm, practiced. We ain't here for the old man. We ain't here for the boy. Send out the girl and it ends. Jonas stepped onto the porch, rifle aimed but not fired. It ended already. You just don't like how. Laughter rose from the dark, mean and short. Clayton don't rot in cells. You think his own daddy'll keep him locked? No, sir. He's walking free soon, and when he does, the first thing he'll take back is what you tried to steal. Jonas's voice cut back harder now. She's not yours to take. Not now, not ever. Silence followed. Then the riders wheeled away, retreating into the night. Jonas held still until the hoofbeats faded. When he turned, Ellie stood in the doorway, shoulders squared. We can't wait for them to come back again, she said. We take this where everyone can see. Tommy swallowed. You mean into town? She nodded. Daylight. The way we did before. Hiding keeps their lies alive. Jonas studied her, the fire in her eyes. She had been carried to his porch half dead. Now she spoke like someone who'd buried fear and marked the grave. He knew she was right. At dawn, they prepared. Jonas cleaned his rifle with slow precision. Tommy tightened his holster hands steadier than they'd ever been. Ellie braided her hair back, tied it with a strip of blue cloth torn from the dress. She looked at herself in the mirror, did not flinch, did not cover it. Her reflection was bruised still, but hers again. The ride into town was different this time. Not defiant, not desperate. Deliberate. Each hoofbeat marked a choice. By the time they reached Main Street, people were already watching from porches and windows. Some whispered, some scowled, but none turned away. The sheriff stood outside the jail, iron keys in hand, face drawn as if the weight of the badge had finally cut into his bones. Beside him, Clayton leaned against the wall, smirk thin but alive. He was free. Ellie slid down from the mule, her bare feet dusting the street. The crowd parted, silent as church. "You think a cell holds me?" Clayton called, his voice carrying like a preacher's lie. "I walk where I want. And he pointed at Ellie, eyes cold, she's mine to finish." Before Jonas could lift his rifle, Ellie stepped forward. Her voice rang clear. "No, I am not yours. Not ever." The words cracked the silence like thunder. Gasps broke, murmurs rose, and the sheriff's face twisted between blood and duty. Clayton pushed off the wall, hand dropping toward his belt. But Tommy moved first, pistol raised, voice raw. "You'll not touch her again." The street held its breath, waiting to see if blood or truth would write the next line. The world seemed to freeze when Tommy's pistol leveled at Clayton. Dust hung in the air. Unmoving sunlight struck down hard enough to bleach every shadow, and the crowd forgot how to breathe. Clayton's smirk faltered, but pride stitched it back into place. He spread his arms wide as if daring the bullet. "Go on then, coward," he taunted, voice loud, sharp enough to cut the morning stillness. "You couldn't do it once. You think you can now in front of them all." Tommy's jaw clenched, the pistol shaking just enough for the crowd to notice. Shame burned red up his neck. For a moment it looked as though Clayton's words had reached him, as though the boy might fold under the weight of his own weakness. Then Ellie stepped between them. Not fast, not reckless, just steady. Her bare feet pressed into the dust, her chin raised. She did not look at Tommy, did not look at the pistol. Her eyes locked on Clayton. "You had your chance," she said, her voice calm, every word deliberate. "You tried to erase me. You failed. Now the whole town sees you for what you are. I don't need a gun to prove it. I just need to keep standing." The murmurs swelled, people shifting, whispering voices growing. Clayton's bravado thinned. He glanced at faces he had once owned with fear and laughter. Now they turned from him, some in disgust, others in shame. The sheriff stepped forward, sweat glistening on his brow. "Son," he rasped, hand outstretched. "Enough." Clayton spun on him, fury twisting his features. "You put irons on me. Your own blood, and for what? For her, a servant girl," he spat into the dirt. "You're weaker than the rest of them." Jonas finally moved his rifle, steady as stone. "This ends now," he said. "No threat, just fact." Clayton's hand darted to his holster. Before he could draw, Tommy fired not into Clayton, but into the ground at his feet. The crack split the air, startling horses, jolting the crowd. "I won't kill you," Tommy said, his voice trembling but loud. "Because killing you makes me like you. But I'll not stand by either." Clayton froze, caught between rage and disbelief. His grip on the pistol slackened. Ellie took another step closer, so near now that everyone could see the rope scars on her wrists, the bruises fading, but still raw. "You can't scare me anymore," she said. The words broke something in Clayton. His shoulders sagged, his smirk collapsed into a snarl. He lunged not for a weapon this time, but straight at Ellie. Jonas moved faster than his years suggested. The rifle butt met Clayton's jaw with a crack that echoed down the street. Clayton crumpled into the dust-spitting blood and curses. The sheriff stood over him, hands shaking as it reached once more for the irons. His eyes darted across the crowd, neighbors, friends, wives, children all watching. He knew the choice he made now would brand him forever. Slowly, he snapped the cuffs shut again, heavier this time. Clayton thrashed, shouting, "You'll regret this, every one of you." But no one answered. Instead, the crowd began to murmur. Not fear now, but something firmer. Women straightened their backs. Men lowered their guns. A boy perched on a barrel shouted, "We seen the truth," and the shout rippled into nods, into voices agreeing. The sheriff dragged his son away, shoulders bent beneath a weight heavier than any badge. Silence settled once more. Ellie swayed breath shallow, but she didn't fall. Tommy holstered his pistol with shaking hands, sweat streaking his dust-caked face. Jonas exhaled slow, lowering his rifle. They left the town without ceremony, the eyes of the people following. Some full of pity, some of gratitude, some of shame. But no one turned away. Back at the cabin, Ellie sank onto the porch steps, pressing her hands to her knees as if to hold herself in place. "It's not over," she whispered. "No," Jonas agreed, "but it's begun." Tommy sat against the fence, arms draped over his knees. "I thought pulling that trigger would make me whole," he said quietly. "It didn't, but maybe not pulling it did." Ellie looked at him, a small flicker in her eyes. Recognition, maybe even forgiveness. "You chose to stand," she said. "That's more than most." Night fell softer than usual. Jonas lit a lamp inside, its glow spilling onto the porch. Ellie didn't cover the mirror that night. She left it bare, her reflection faint but visible in the dim light. She glanced at it once, then turned away without flinching. Jonas watched her, the needle moving steady in her hands as she stitched. He felt something he hadn't in years, the sense that tomorrow mattered. But the West was not finished with them. Whispers spread beyond town, carried on trails where men listened more to gold and whiskey than truth. Clayton's name was poison, but poison can linger long after the man is gone. And in the dark beyond the ridge, fires flickered where strangers camped. Strangers who had no loyalty to law or justice, only to the coin that might be paid by a desperate sheriff trying to salvage his legacy. Jonas knew the quiet they had bought today would not last. Dawn came gray, the kind of morning where even the birds hesitated to sing. Jonas sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees, pipe cold between his teeth. He hadn't slept. The quiet was too sharp, and he knew quiet like this meant something was moving in the dark. Ellie came out with a cup of weak coffee, set it beside him without a word, then sat on the step below her, hands clasped in her lap. Behind them, Tommy stirred in the barn loft where he had taken to sleeping. His body still bore Clayton's bruises, but his face had begun to change. Less boy, more man, carved by choices rather than years. He climbed down, rubbing his eyes, and joined them. "They'll come," he said simply. "Maybe today," Jonas replied. The three of them waited. When the sun finally cut the horizon, a rider appeared on the ridge, then another, then four more. Men with hard eyes and harder mouths, hired guns, not townsfolk. Jonas knew the type. They weren't here for justice. They were here for pay. The riders halted at the edge of the yard. Their leader, a scarred man with a grin too wide, raised a hand. "Sheriff says the girl comes with us. Settle this clean." Ellie rose, standing barefoot in the dust. Her voice didn't waver. "Tell the sheriff he already lost me. Tell him I won't be owned again." The leader chuckled. "Wasn't asking, miss." He nudged his horse forward. Jonas lifted his rifle, calm as stone. "Then you best start shooting, 'cause she ain't leaving." The yard held its breath. Tommy stepped up beside Jonas, pistol drawn. His hand didn't shake this time. "You'll ride through me first," he said. For a long heartbeat, no one moved. Then the scarred man spat, turned his horse, and barked a laugh. "Not worth it. Not today." With a signal, the riders wheeled around and thundered back over the ridge, dust trailing like smoke. Ellie exhaled, knees nearly buckling. Jonas lowered his rifle, but his eyes stayed fixed on the ridge. "They'll be back," he muttered. "Maybe," Ellie said, straightening. "Maybe not. But they didn't take me. That's enough for today." She turned toward the cabin, her shoulders squared. Jonas watched her, and something inside him loosened. She was not the broken girl who had crawled into his yard. She was a woman who had learned to stand, and in her standing, he found reason to believe again. Days passed. The threats quieted. The sheriff, broken by the weight of his son's disgrace, resigned his badge. Clayton was taken east in chains by marshals who did not care for family ties. The town, once ruled by fear, began to lift its head. At the cabin, life stitched itself into a new pattern. Ellie's herb patch flourished green against the brown. Jonas's shirts, once threadbare, bore neat seams where her needle had worked. Tommy built a pen for goats. His hands calloused, his back stronger. The silence that had once haunted the place now sounded different, no longer empty, but full of breathing, working living. One evening, Ellie sat on the porch, the last of the light painting her face gold. She looked at the mirror through the open window and did not turn it away. "I used to think I was nothing," she said softly. "But I was wrong. I'm still here. I'm still me." Jonas leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. You're more than you were. So are we. Tommy, sitting on the steps with a whittling knife, nodded. We ain't blood, but maybe that don't matter. Maybe family's just who stays when it'd be easier to leave. Silence fell warm and steady, a silence that did not suffocate but soothed. The west stretched wide around them, dust and blood and sky. But in that forgotten cabin, something rare had taken root. Not victory, not triumph. Something quieter. Survival braided into hope. And sometimes Jonas thought that was the bravest thing anyone could choose.